go. Okay, we are now officially recording. Once again, welcome to this all advisory body briefing on Special Project 1, Adaptive Management and Flexibility. Sorry, it's being a little slow to advance. Okay, there we go. So I thought we could just start here with an overview of Special Project 1, which is one of 3 special projects that are supported with dedicated funding that was provided to the Council via the Inflation Reduction Act through grants from the National Marine Fisheries Service. And there are 3 projects total. This is Project 1. And if anybody's curious about the other 2, I'd be happy to answer any questions about those as we go along as well. The objective of Special Project 1 is to identify innovations that make the review and implementation of council actions more timely, efficient, and responsive to a changing ocean environment and other unexpected events. So there's a real emphasis in this project on, perhaps the name gives it away, on adaptive capacity and flexibility in response to rapid changes. Just by way of just sort of a quick trip down memory lane, the last time this project was before the council was in September of last year in the meeting in Spokane, and that's where the council scoped the project and sort of established scope for the project. And at that meeting, the council also adopted a problem statement and identified 3 priority areas to advance under the project. And the problem statement appears on the left side here, and I'll just read it real quick in case it's helpful. This is what was adopted by the council as part of their motion under this item in September. Because management decisions in the council process often unfold over years, council actions can lag behind changes in the marine environment related to climate change and other unexpected events, for example, natural disasters, pandemics, and may not keep pace with the science that underpins management decisions. We need to improve council processes and operating procedures to support timely responses to rapidly changing conditions. So that sort of sets the tone for the project going forward. And also as part of that motion, the council identified 3 priority areas to further explore and advance under this project. And those are the development of if-then statements and in-season management actions for FMPs where they make sense to allow action to happen outside of a council meeting. And that was sort of an important component of that first bullet, just finding ways for action to take place outside of or in between council meetings if needed, so that to improve responsiveness times. The second component is, or priority area is, exempted fishing permit process improvements for all FMPs using lessons learned from the Fisheries Innovation Work Group, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the EFP section of the presentation. And that would also include pathways to efficiently move tested EFPs into regulation. And then finally, improved processes for, it says date streams, but data streams that would be, and integration of local and Indigenous knowledge. So those are the 3 main focal areas of the project going forward as established by the council. For the briefing book materials for this item for the April meeting, there are 5 items currently, and of course there will be advisory body statements, et cetera, going forward. But attachment 1, just as a quick little sort of orientation of what's in the briefing book, is a brief sort of overview of the process and timeline of the sort of the various pieces of this project going forward. It includes a sort of a draft Gantt chart that kind of lays out the work that could potentially happen between now and the end of 2026. However, this project will likely spill over into 2027 as well, but the Gantt chart only goes through the end of this calendar year. Attachment 2 is a staff report on the if-then statements and in-season actions portion of the project. Attachment 3 is a staff report on EFP process improvements. Attachment 4 is integration of local and Indigenous knowledge, and supplemental attachment 5 is council action meeting requirements. And this is the new addition that I mentioned earlier when we were going over the agenda. And this basically is a brief sort of 2-page attachment that really just asks whether the council would like to consider an approach to reducing the number of required meetings for certain council actions and decisions, namely non-controversial, broadly supported items. This attachment does not include any potential action items, but just proposes that if there is interest and if tasked, council staff could bring forward more information and more of a sort of an approach to moving forward in September or at a later meeting. And this is in response to some guidance from the council back in September that essentially said that if there were procedural efficiencies from the 2025 scoping paper that seemed ripe or appropriate to move forward with, that council staff should explore those further. And just moving on to the council tasks and actions for this upcoming item at the April meeting. The tasks are to consider the potential action items that are described in the staff reports and to provide any guidance on identifying preliminary preferred actions to advance under Special Project 1. This would be work that could be done between now and the September meeting to bring forward a more detailed approaches and bodies of work, etc. And then to provide any guidance on next steps, including sequencing actions if necessary. And the action here would be for the council to adopt preliminary preferred alternatives. In this case, they would be probably more like preliminary preferred actions as opposed to alternatives, and then provide any guidance on next steps. And so with that, I will go ahead and jump into the first sort of content piece of this, I guess, which is the if-then statements and in-season management actions section of the project. And I'm also going to try to keep an eye on any questions that may come up along the way. Okay, good. So essentially, if-then statements and in-season management actions are strategies that are widely considered to be capable of facilitating faster decision-making in the face of changing conditions. And they can serve as key pathways to improving management flexibility and responsiveness, mostly because they enable generally faster action in response to rapidly changing conditions. And so I just thought it might be helpful to provide a couple of these, the sort of the working definitions that we are operating under for the purposes of the agenda item. For if-then statements, these are, excuse me, let me just get rid of that. Okay, there we go. Are actions that predefine, these are statements that predefine specific actions that would be taken when certain conditions are met. And they consist of predetermined generalized responses. And this is important, the thresholds that trigger them to different scenarios where analysis and review of those responses are all completed in advance. And they're designed to anticipate a wide range of potential scenarios and allow for much faster management responses, usually without a council meeting or a regulatory change. And in-season management actions on the right side of the screen are regulatory changes made while efficient season is already in progress to respond quickly to new data or emerging conditions. The council generally uses two sort of different approaches to in-season management. One is the groundfish model, where in-season adjustments take place usually at a council meeting and often or maybe always require council action. And then there is the salmon model, where in-season actions can be taken outside of or without a council meeting. Oh, and actually, before I move on, I'll just say, just in case it's helpful, just one example of an if-then statement that is cited in the the staff report under attachment 2 here is just sort of a West Coast example is that of bluefin tuna trip limit regulations, where, for example, if total catch is within a certain amount of the annual limit, let's say X amount of the annual limit, between January and June of a given year, the trip limit automatically would decrease to Y amount. And this is a change that can be made without a meeting or a regulation change. And probably, as just noted on the screen here, one of the more prevalent examples of in-season management actions for the West Coast is that of the Pacific Coast Salmon FMP, where catch monitoring provides daily information for tracking catch against quota. And as this information is processed, the FMP allows for regulations to be modified as needed through regular and frequent consultation with fishery advisors. So things like season length, location fished, and year type can all be modified in season based on current and almost real-time information and daily and or weekly projections, and also without a council meeting. All right. So just moving on then to the potential action items that are described in this portion of the briefing book materials. These can be found in attachment 2 under agenda item H1. Attachment 2 here describes a potential approach to considering the development of new or expanded if-then statements. And so this would be action number 1. And this is essentially describes a framework that could help the council maximize and sort of better take advantage or leverage if-then opportunities when they arise. And this would provide a way to balance potential workload trade-offs and ensure that new if-then statements are adding as much value as possible. The staff report does describe a little bit or it goes into a little discussion of the fact that the development of if-then statements can be pretty labor intensive and resource intensive on the front end, because they require a fair amount of analysis in order to sort of cover all of the various scenarios that you're trying to sort of account for or predict could happen, that you're trying to stay within the bounds of. So it's a fair amount of upfront work, and so the council may want to consider sort of not exactly a checklist, but just sort of a series of considerations that it would like to make sure are conditions that are met before deciding whether or not to forge ahead with a specific if-then statement, just to make sure that it's going to sort of provide as much benefit as possible in terms of both responding appropriately to certain conditions and also providing the sort of timeliness and responsiveness that the council might be seeking. For potential action item 2, this would be something that came up in the council's discussion back in September, which is to basically just conduct sort of a review or not even really an analysis, but just sort of a bigger overview of the current use of if-then statements in both NMFS regulations and the council process, to just sort of bring together all of the various if-then statements that are in use in the council's purview, and that would sort of serve as a bit of just a kind of a resource for the council to refer to in terms of like, how are these if-thens working and how often are they used, et cetera. There could be just sort of a quick kind of a review of how those things are going in terms of how they're being deployed on the ground, as it were. And then for action item 3, this would be something that the council could consider just requesting that management teams in collaboration with their respective advisory subpanels review and consider opportunities to develop if-then statements and or new in-season management actions as a sort of some dedicated time on their agendas to think about whether there are places or areas where these two approaches could be used or expanded, et cetera. And this would be, I think it was back in September that when the council was discussing it, that there was a fair amount of just acknowledgement of the fact that if-then statements in particular should be something like, if they come up and if it seems like a really good approach to solving a problem or improving a situation, that the council should be in a position where it's ready to go, but it doesn't necessarily have to go looking sort of, under the couch cushions for potential if-then statements. It's more of like when the opportunity arises, and where the situation may call for it, or where it might really make sense, there should be a pathway to being able to move forward with efficiency, and just making sure that those pieces are in place. And part of that could be giving advisory bodies a chance to some dedicated time to discuss these opportunities and whether there's anything that would benefit from an if-then or some expanded or new in-season management action opportunities. And also, I just wanted to mention before I leave this slide that there are some examples of if-then statements that appear on pages 4 and 5 of attachment 2 here, and they are carried over from the September scoping paper. And these are not necessarily, they're not exactly new ideas. They're ideas that were sort of just put forward as kind of potential ideas to sort of spark further discussion back in September. And they are included here in this staff report under this agenda item for a similar purpose, just to sort of get the old wheels turning. They have not yet been discussed with relevant advisory bodies or with the council, and they're not intended at this time to be considered as part of the potential action items here. These are the sorts of things that that advisory bodies could potentially discuss under action 3 on the screen. Like, are there ideas that that are sparked by the examples in attachment 2, but those discussions would first need to happen at the FMP specific level with advisory bodies. So those, I think there's 3 different sort of examples of what of potential ideas that are in the paper that are really just there for discussion purposes and not for consideration for inclusion in this action. And so I think with that, I will turn things over to Ms. Katie Westfall for our EFP discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Gilly. And thanks for having me as sort of a special guest here on one of the items on for Special Project 1. I'm going to run through the EFP process improvements section, and I'll give a brief intro. I think this crowd is pretty familiar with exempted fishing permits, but generally they are permits issued by NMFS that authorizes an activity that is otherwise prohibited by regulations. On the West Coast, EFPs have been instrumental, and they can play a very important role in supporting innovation that builds capacity for adapting to changing ocean conditions. And that, of course, in order to serve that purpose, they need to be used on timelines that keep pace with changing ocean conditions. So just a quick note on roles. The briefing paper, the staff attachment has lays out sort of the process in more detail and defines kind of the roles. So folks are, if they're interested in that, they can check out the staff attachment. But generally, NMFS has the authority to issue or deny EFPs, and the council, of course, conducts its own EFP process and provides recommendations to NMFS. And this body of work focuses on the council side of the equation, so really focuses on the council's role. So to really look at the challenges and to develop potential action items for council consideration, we use sort of 3 main research tools. We looked at lessons from the Fisheries Innovation Work Group process. Gilly mentioned that this ad hoc group has really been doing a deep dive on identifying process improvements related to EFPs as they relate to HMS EFPs. So we drew on some of this work in these conversations to inform several potential actions, understanding that not all of the FUSE work is going to be appropriate across FMPs, but that certainly there may be some items that do make sense across FMPs. We also held discussions with West Coast experts. So this included NMFS, council, and state agency staff, as well as current and former EFP applicants from industry and research institutions. And we also mapped the EFP process, looking at both NMFS processes as well as the council's role in reviewing EFPs, and developed flowcharts that we're still refining and fine-tuning to really kind of look at where some of those key coordination opportunities are. So in this process, we identified a couple challenges. We identified some confusion about the process and roles. Some fishery participants have described sort of a steep learning curve for new applicants and confusion about navigating the EFP process and what the roles are. Existing documents and materials, some of them are out of date and not perfectly aligned with current practices. We also have heard concerns around NMFS and council workload and resource constraints. So that remains a core challenge in a lot of our discussions in just really overwhelming workloads. So we kept that in mind as we were developing some of these potential action items. We also heard concerns related to timing, schedule, and process delays, and some limited opportunities for submission. So timelines can really vary depending on the complexity of the EFP and staff availability. Longer timelines can obviously affect an applicant's ability to fish in a given season or when conditions may be more favorable. And for some of the FMPs, there's limited opportunity to submit EFPs for council review, depending on sort of how the harvest specifications work and the timing around those. We also heard some challenges related to reporting and data compilation inconsistencies. So participants in some of these discussions talked about issues with the quality and format of reporting received by EFP holders, and then also some challenges on the staff side in terms of compiling data and ensuring quality control. We also heard some challenges related to an unclear and lengthy pathway from EFP to regulatory change. So that's happened in several cases. And the process for moving EFP, can be really lengthy and undefined. So during this phase, questions can emerge about potential impacts and risks, as well as sort of the sufficiency of data. And so we tried to look at that as a challenge as well. So next slide, please, Gilly. We wanted to really organize these actions around different tiers and really look at, obviously, the most important tier of actions, which is high impact, low effort. So we developed a set of potential actions for council consideration. The first one relates to creating clear EFP materials for applicants. As I mentioned, council materials can be outdated, and there could be a lot of benefit for providing more information for fishery participants to navigate the process and really understand NMFS and council roles. Second action relates to trying to find ways to prioritize applicants who are likely to actively use EFPs. This relates to, looking to see if there are any benefits in terms of a staffing and kind of workload perspective at prioritizing applications from applicants who are really likely to actively fish and generate useful data, while also working to maintain transparent and equitable access to anyone who wants to use the EFP process. So I can talk a little bit more detail in that one if folks have questions. Action 3 relates to looking at the council research priorities and looking at which ones are really well suited to increasing adaptive capacity and which ones are well suited for EFPs. So as many folks are aware, the council finalized the research and data needs document in this past summer, the summer of June 2025, and the list includes many research priorities across 9 broad topics. Council staff could look at this and really see which ones could increase resilience and responsiveness to changing ocean conditions, and which ones would be appropriate for EFPs to kind of signal kind of a set of potential priority topics for EFPs. Action 4 relates to promoting efficiency and flexibility in EFP applications and in council recommendations. So there were a couple ideas that sort of fit this this header, looking at encouraging the bundling of similar applications. So as there's some work on the front end to kind of work with industry or whoever wants to submit an EFP to kind of bundle applications under one, folks who want to fish under one application potentially. There's the idea of multi-year endorsements. Is there an opportunity to kind of proactively endorse something that might be very low risk or low low controversy. There's could be opportunities to provide flexibility in council recommendations, making sure to provide, not constraining EFPs by specific terms and conditions that might, really limit flexibility. And then are there other opportunities in the review process to provide more flexibilities on, if it's a 2-meeting process, are there opportunities to come back on, during a meeting where there might be that FMP agenda, items of that FMP on, to provide, to shorten the process for those who might need to come back through a 2-meeting process. Action 5 relates to standardizing the protocol for initial review of EFP applications. This is something that varies across FMP. The entity who conducts this preliminary review for HMS, NIMS provides this sort of initial vetting and early coordination with applicants, while for Groundfish and CPS, the MTs provide this role. There might be good reason to keep it that way, but we wanted to put that on a table just to see if that's what that current process is best serving the council and NIMS. Action 6 relates to allowing a 1-meeting process for certain EFPs, and recently, this was one of the few changes. They modified the COP to allow HMS EFPs to be endorsed at a single meeting. Also for CPS, the COP for that FMP was modified in 2022 to allow renewing EFPs to be endorsed at a single meeting. The council could potentially consider applying this approach to, across FMPs to all EFPs, and sort of allowing this 1-meeting process for a certain type of EFPs. So that's the first set of actions. Gilly, next slide, please. The second set of options relate to potential actions that are high impact but moderate effort. These, will require a little bit more work from council staff and a little bit more consideration from the council as they get fleshed out. But action 7 is, as I mentioned, some of the materials, including the COPs, can be out of date and not aligned perfectly with current practices. So action 7 relates to making technical edits and updates to the COPs. This could be done either through an umbrella COP that looks at combining all of the EFP-related COPs, or if this action is of interest, it also could be done by editing the COPs individually. Action 8 relates to developing criteria for considering EFPs outside of designated windows. So for certain FMPs, there are certain windows where EFPs are accepted. The council could consider creating criteria for allowing out-of-cycle EFPs, such as proposals that might be tied to funding with certain timing deadlines, the proposals that do not require allocation set-asides, or EFPs that might be responding to a specific or time-limited, set of environmental conditions. Action 9 relates to front-loading environmental analyses and trying to build in flexibilities where are appropriate. And I think a lot of folks know that one of the most time-intensive phases of EFP review can be ensuring consistency with federal laws, including NEPA and ESA, front-loading environmental analyses and designing these analyses to be broad enough in scope to really try to meet the need of the types of EFPs that are expected could substantially improve the efficiency of the reviews for EFPs. Action 10 relates to creating more efficiency, consistency, and accessibility for reporting and data. One of the key themes that came up in discussions was these inconsistencies in EFP reporting in terms of quality and format, and then challenges related to data compilation. So there could be some opportunities to work with NIMS to develop EFP report templates to try to standardize the format of EFP reporting. The council could also work with NIMS and PACFIN and other data entities to develop data intake protocols, and really kind of improve the accessibility of providing some of that data on dashboards and creating visualizations. Action 11 relates to creating a checkpoint schedule for considering EFP-informed management changes. So I think I highlighted some of the examples where it can take a long time to go from EFP to regulatory change. One of the ideas here is there could be a checkpoint after a specific time frame to really review EFP fishing and kind of have a set of potential paths forward depending on sort of the results of those EFPs. And lastly, the Action 12 is to create templates potentially for assessing risk and scientific uncertainty when considering those EFP regulatory changes. Oftentimes issues come up about potential impacts and risks related to impacts, as well as I mentioned, questions about how much data is enough to really kind of move forward. The council could look at if risk table templates could be helpful to support council discussions, as well as coupling that with a structured assessment of scientific uncertainty to really kind of provide the information needed to evaluate moving forward to regulation. So that's the suite of potential actions. And I will mention briefly that while EFPs are an incredibly important way to test new approaches and technologies, in this ability to, to really kind of build the adaptive capacity that will be needed. There are other opportunities to promote on the water research and innovation. So this could include cooperative research programs, research fisheries, regional collaboratives, and public-private partnerships. Council staff could also explore these types of opportunities beyond EFPs if that's of interest to the council. But just to mention that EFPs are a very important tool for innovation, but not the only tool in the toolbox. And then in terms of next steps, Gilly will probably go through this in the wrap up, but certainly the council can take no action, could select any combination of these actions, or could identify others that were not listed. And then based on the council's direction, staff will you will kind of work to further develop these ideas for the September meeting. And then if there are any items that the council has interest in on COP modifications, that potentially could come back in June of 2026. So that's the gist of the EFP potential actions. And I will give the mic back to Gilly.
Great. Thank you so much, Katie. And I will just keep on heading into the next item, which is integrating local and Indigenous knowledge into council processes and decision-making. And I just wanted to, I guess, just not even take a step back, but just sort of mention that the staff report for this item spend some time talking about the value of incorporation of local knowledge and Indigenous knowledge into fisheries management, and how the use of both systems of knowledge have been identified as actions that can really help to increase both the resilience and responsiveness of fisheries management, and better, sort of more coherent integration of LK and IK, as I will abbreviate them for now, into council decision-making may also create opportunities for the co-development of scientific and socioeconomic information, while potentially increasing trust and transparency across the council's management system and framework. And I thought it might be helpful just to touch on these two definitions that appear in the attachment 4 here, that describe, that sort of serve as working definitions for local knowledge and Indigenous knowledge. And perhaps I won't read them in their entirety, but just to sort of highlight some of their key differences, just in terms of who holds these forms of knowledge, and the sort of the time frames over which they accrue. Local knowledge is generally something that can be acquired over the course of a few generations or less, whereas Indigenous knowledge is something that has been that can be accumulated and acquired over the course of millennia. And I will also mention that as we go forward into the potential action items for for this piece of the project. I'll just note here that the council did request an action plan for both local knowledge and Indigenous knowledge under this umbrella, while also recognizing the significant distinctions between these two knowledge systems. And so in preparing this information for the briefing book and for council consideration in April, council staff found that there is likely going to be a benefit to sequencing these two areas of focus, just given their very important differences. And as a result, we're recommending in the staff report that efforts to explore pathways for the better integration of Indigenous knowledge in particular be undertaken as a separate phase of this work. So the potential action items that are described going forward here are the focus of the integration of local knowledge only at this point, with the understanding that council staff will turn toward the Indigenous knowledge component of Special Project 1 following the April meeting. It just is something that's happening on a sort of a slightly different time frame, and we want to be as thoughtful and deliberate about that as possible. So once again, the ideas going forward are focused on local knowledge, LK only at this time. And with that, I will also just mention, just by way of maybe some additional framing for this piece of the project, the staff report does include some key questions just for sort of evaluating potential actions under this section, just basically in terms of the ways in which local knowledge would be solicited, received, used, integrated, etc. And so there are some questions here on the screen. I won't go through all of them, but basically just ways to sort of, and these are also in attachment 4 for folks to sort of refer to if you'd like to do a little bit of a deeper dive. But basically just really trying to think of the sort of the ways in which this information would be brought forward into council decision making. Is it for adding additional context and sort of providing sort of a fuller picture, or is it being used in scientific or analytical products? So there's sort of an end use question there as well. So these are just some things to sort of keep in the hopper as we go forward. So for the potential action items, these can be found again in attachment 4 here. And action 1A is an idea that came up recently while the ecosystem status report was being considered at the March meeting. This is an idea for setting up an email portal of some kind that could be hosted either by the council or by perhaps the California Current Ecosystem Integrated Ecosystem Assessment Team, but a way for members of the public or members of advisory teams or ocean users or fishermen or anybody who's seeing anything on the water to be able to provide observations or anything that they're seeing that might be unusual to sort of a central email address. And this is something that would be patterned after email sort of approach for collecting information that's hosted by the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council, but they provide that information directly to the Northeast Fisheries Science Center for their Mid-Atlantic State of the Ecosystem Report. So it's just sort of a nice way of being able to collect that information in one place. And then what the Mid-Atlantic State of the Ecosystem Report then summarizes that information as sort of a section of its ESR. So for action item 1B, this would then be the information that feeds into a potential new ecosystem status report section or an appendix for capturing and sort of going into a little more detail with on the water observations. And again, all of this could be used to sort of increase the ability to sort of understand the different things that might be happening that aren't necessarily reflected in other ways of measuring either ocean conditions or other kinds of things that are reflected in the ESR. And that also leads sort of directly into action item 2, which is an idea that also came up, as folks may or may not recall, during the March the council's March discussion of the ecosystem status report. There was an idea that was that was discussed of whether it would be possible to schedule or set up some sort of evening session for fishermen to come together at a council meeting to provide these kinds of observations or other kinds of impressions directly to the CCIEA team for use in the ecosystem status report or elsewhere. And this is also something that could be broadened out to not just the ESR, of course, but are there ways of bringing together folks when they're perhaps already planning on attending a council meeting? And so there's sort of a lower barrier to getting folks there, but for bringing people together to be able to discuss in the presence of council members or in conjunction with or in conversation with advisory bodies, et cetera, a chance for people to come together and talk about what they are observing on the water. And so that's something that the staff report goes into a little more detail on, and would also potentially provide more information or information beyond what would potentially already be captured in advisory body reports. Action 3 is something called fishery performance reports. This would be something that is that could be modeled after, again, something that the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council does, which is they develop fishery performance reports for each of their fisheries, and they describe these reports as basically a description of the factors that influenced fishing effort and catch within each of the council's fisheries, generally from the previous year. And they're intended to summarize fishermen's on-the-water perspectives, and they are in turn then provided to the council and its SSC every year. And they find that the Mid-Atlantic has found that this, again, is generally more contextual in terms of the information that it provides, but that information and that additional context can become particularly important during the process of setting quotas, especially for data poor stocks. It's sort of like another line of information that the SSC and the council can consider. And the attachment 4 goes into a little more detail on how those are put together every year at the Mid-Atlantic, and is, maybe something that the Pacific Council could consider doing a similar version of. And action 4 is a little sort of potentially related, but a little broader than the fishery performance reports. This is, we've shorthanded it here as an on-the-water observations feedback tool. And what this would be is that folks may or may not be familiar with something that the Gulf Council does, which is called the Fisherman's Feedback Tool. And this is a sort of a portal on their website and that they've been doing for the past several years, I think since 2019. It was originally called Something's Fishy, so people might know it as that, but they changed the name to Fisherman's Feedback Tool. And it's basically a way to, the link to the tool is distributed to fishermen sort of far and wide. It's not just connected to advisory bodies or management teams or anything like that. It's something that any member of the public could respond to or provide their information, and essentially fishermen can provide any information about any sort of area of the ocean where they happen to be fishing within the Gulf's region, and they can provide information on changes in the number, size, behavior, or appearance of fish, shifts in fishing effort, or any other notable trends or unusual observations, and then they capture the place where they've been, the actual location of where they've been fishing, so that there's a sort of a way to sort of identify where these things are happening. And for each piece of feedback, the council sort of has 2 readers that independently review the response, and then they assign a sentiment or they assign a sort of a sentiment value to be able to conduct a sentiment analysis, so positive, neutral, mixed, or negative. And then the council staff then generates a report, which is shared with the council, its SSC, and relevant stock assessment teams. And so again, this is sort of, another way to bring in information that would not necessarily be captured in stock assessments or another sort of through other scientific instruments. And the results can be sort of considered appropriately alongside other information. And so again, this would be, something that the Pacific Council could think about sort of modeling doing something that's modeled on what the Gulf Council has done with some success. And then finally, action 5 here is sort of just a broader idea around potentially, would the council like to host a workshop to identify the local knowledge priorities and pathways that would be most of most interest to the holders of local knowledge, and also thinking about ways in which that information could be brought forward to the council in a way that can be best used in decision making and in any sort of scientific products where this information might be able to be integrated. So a chance to bring together fishermen, other stakeholders, science center folks, council members, et cetera, advisory body members, to really think through, like, okay, what makes the most sense for our region. And this is something that we talk about a little bit in the report as being something that could be as, sort of as sort of streamlined and, as light a lift as an evening session at an existing council meeting, or something that could be a little bit of a deeper dive that might require more resources, which we note that we may or may not have, but something to at least think about. And then finally, the Attack 4 does go into a bit of detail about a number of other different kinds of ongoing processes and other ideas that are out there that have come up in conversation with respect to the, Special Project 1. And so those sort of start on page 14 of the report. But just, as Katie mentioned, there's a nexus back to, for example, the Council's research and data needs document. There might be some, there's a number of things in there around stakeholder engagement and being able to bring forward fishermen's knowledge into the process. There are some upcoming methodology reviews that might be of interest with respect to the use of information that's fishery dependent. And there are some things that are external to the council that are ongoing as well, such as the Oregon Coast Anglers Sport Angler Science Project and other things where people are already doing this kind of citizen science or community science type work. Are there ways of, thinking about doing more stuff like that, or different stuff that might be, more applicable directly to the council's needs? So yes, that is the gist of the LKIK piece, which is just LK for now. And I do see a hand up. So maybe I'll stop for just a moment and see if, it looks like Heather Mann had a question.
Yeah, thanks, Gilly. Thanks so much for the presentation. I think you're probably aware that in the North Pacific, we've been doing an LKTK process for a really long time. They didn't bifurcate it, but they moved forward with both. I guess one of the things we've struggled with up there is actually how the data is, or that knowledge is used. And so, for example, somebody could provide information that says, well, when the trees are turning X, then we know that the fish are coming Y into the river, something like that. And it's really good information that they have gleaned. And this is, of course, traditional knowledge, which is the indigenous part that we're not there yet in the Pacific. But once you have that information, how it gets incorporated, like what vehicle or on-ramp to actually get it into the process, is a challenge. And so I'm wondering, you went into detail about some of the other councils and like how the portals are set up. But are there any examples of how that traditional or local knowledge actually was used in decision making? Because it seemed like it stopped right there. So I'm just curious about it being actually used and if that makes sense.
It does, yes. Thank you very much. Yeah, I will. I'd be happy to try to answer that. And then also recognizing that is, I know that's a huge question that I think as we and this council sort of, if it chooses to proceed with some of this work, will be, I think, so important to sort of to really drill down on what are those on-ramps, how are we using it, can it be used, in certain ways? What ways can it not be used? What are those limits, et cetera? I will say that in talking with folks from other regions, they were mostly the Gulf Council, the South Atlantic Council, and the Mid-Atlantic, though recognizing that I want to say that it's possible that New England uses fishery performance reports as well. I could be wrong about that, but just talking with some of our colleagues in other regions, I think everybody agreed that having more of this kind of information is incredibly helpful for helping to maybe, I don't know quite what the right word is, but the word that was used by one of our colleagues in another region was it might be able to inform levels of sort of optimism or pessimism in terms of like whether when an SSC is considering certain information, does it help to sort of, add that additional context for being able to maybe, feel more comfortable sort of going in one direction or another with respect to its work. And so I think that one thing that we've been talking about a little bit on staff here is really like going into quite a bit of, sort of like digging down into describing what those sort of thresholds and limits might be in terms of where this information can come into play. And that's where some of those questions from that earlier slide try to sort of, kind of grapple with, like how, where, when, like whose information is, being brought forward in what ways. So anyway, that's just sort of a probably a very roundabout way of saying that I think there's a lot more to kind of probably to dig into there for all of us. And I also appreciate, Heather, you're mentioning the LKTKS task force in the North Pacific. We did a lot of, we relied on some of their sort of a lot of the definitions and work that they've done. We sort of, referred to in the report here, attachment 4, just because a lot of that work has obviously, been going on for a little while. I think the task force is now maybe officially done. I'm not sure, but like it's now being, right, as you said, kind of figuring out what the right sort of next steps are there. Anyway, so lots of maybe more questions there than answers. I apologize, but I don't know if that's helpful at all.
I think that's super helpful, Gilly. It's a complex item, but I think that, I believe it's an important item, both traditional knowledge and local knowledge. And I just would hate to see so much work going into it and then having it be like shared with the SSC, but then the SSC just says, well, that's fishery dependent data, or I don't know what, but like, so making sure that we have the right vehicle to make sure it makes its way into the process. And it sounds like from your response, again, I appreciate the response, that there's a lot more discussion we can be having about it and maybe even bring forward at this council meeting in our statements.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you. That's a perfect way of phrasing it. Wonderful. Well, thank you for that. And yes, while I guess I will continue on I think we just have one more slide here. Thank you all for hanging in there with this this magical mystery tour. So supplemental attachment 5, as I mentioned, is a sort of late breaking addition to the briefing book. It is council action meeting requirements. And as mentioned earlier, this was sort of in response to sort of some sort of additional council guidance that was offered back in September. But so basically, as we've just been discussing, that during scoping of this project back in September 2025, the council did prioritize, of course, the 3 focal areas that we've just been talking about: if-then statements, EFP process improvements, and the integration of local and Indigenous knowledge. But the scoping paper that sort of helped to inform that conversation back in September also identified several procedural efficiency ideas that were, maybe a little bit more on the sort of administrative side or council operating procedure side. And as part of the September discussion, the council requested that staff just sort of continue to kind of keep an eye on and explore and potentially scope some of these procedural efficiencies ideas as appropriate, including things that could potentially be pursued under other agenda items and and processes such as the council's ongoing council operations and priorities work, which is sort of shorthanded as council efficiencies, that came out of the committee of the whole work from early 2024. So one of the ideas that was put forward in the scoping paper that kind of bubbled up recently was the question around, are there opportunities to reduce the number of meetings that are required by the council's FMPs and council operating procedures for certain types of actions and measures. And so we thought we would just sort of put together this quick 2-page report, which it looks a little bit longer. There's a couple of appendices that go through meeting requirements by FMP, and also COP 11, which describes the plan amendment cycles for the council's different meetings that are required for developing FMP amendments. And so for this one, if there's interest in this, and if tasked, council staff could spend some time to develop draft criteria and perhaps a proposed approach to applying that criteria to determine if an action could be completed in fewer meetings than under status quo. So for example, instead of a 3-meeting process for an FMP amendment, there might be certain kinds of actions that could be potentially put forward in 2 meetings, things that are low controversy or non-controversial, that have been very well analyzed with a lot of documentation, things that are maybe less complex, where there's a lot of broad support as reflected by advisory body statements and public comment and council discussion, et cetera. And so, other examples could be, there are a number of different kinds of management measures described in FMPs that maybe normally require a 2-meeting process, where there could be an opportunity to, depending on the action, to look at a 1-meeting process. And there's a fair amount of flexibility in the FMP language that would allow for that, I think, without an FMP amendment. So there's ways of potentially looking at this body of work, if there's interest in it, to potentially advance it without having to make any, open up FMPs or do anything like that. And so staff could also then, of course, bring back additional information and maybe a draft framework for consideration at the September meeting or at a later meeting. And I'll also just mention that this is, I think I mentioned at the beginning, this is something that has not yet been discussed by the council. It was not part of the September motion. It was part of more that general guidance around, just sort of, keeping an eye peeled for opportunities to advance some of the procedural efficiencies work. And so, so there are no potential action items associated with this one, other than would the council be interested in hearing more about this, with a little more detail at the September meeting. So that is council action meeting requirements. And I think that brings us to the end of our presentation, other than to say that, as Katie mentioned, in terms of next steps, I just wanted to acknowledge that there are quite a few moving parts here. I think somebody did the math, and there are approximately 19 different sort of potential items here that the council could think about. And I'm guessing that not everything would necessarily move forward, that there will be some mixing and matching and some selecting of subsets of actions that would potentially move forward. And of course, the hard part will be discussing and figuring out what those are. And so I know that's a big part of what the advisory bodies will be doing as they discuss this item at the meeting, at their meetings. And so if there's anything at all that staff can do to help support that discussion in terms of, looking at the array of options available and sort of thinking about, what makes sense to sort of put forward, and or are there other ideas that we've missed that would be helpful for the council to think about as well. So there could certainly be, there's no doubt, lots of other things that are not reflected here. And so as advisory bodies are thinking about that and discussing that at your meetings coming up, if there's stuff that isn't reflected here that should be. There's, that's another chance for the council to be able to think about the universe of options here. And again, the attachment 1 under this agenda item does include, just sort of consolidates everything in one place, minus this council action meeting requirements piece, and offers that Gantt chart to sort of try to put everything in one place graphically. I'm not sure if it's either whether that's helpful or overwhelming. I'm not sure, but it's there just in case it's hopefully helpful and not overwhelming. And perhaps with that, I will temporarily stop sharing and see if we want to open it up to any questions and discussion. Oh, and I see a hand. And of course, if I am not seeing your hand, and I don't know if anybody else wants to just call out their name if you are, somehow or another, they're not rising to the top for some reason or another, but I believe Whitney has her hand up.
Yeah, thanks so much, Gilly and Katie, for the presentation. Very helpful to process the materials in the briefing book. My question is actually related to one of the last points you made, and I was thinking about this as you went through the slides. There's a lot of actions, I think, being proposed across the different materials, and in context of resource and staff workload constraints, how should the council be thinking about the volume of actions that can be taken up at the same time, or how to prioritize different actions if there was interest in a lot of them, how the council should think about narrowing them down given like workload constraints. Yeah, I know that's a question, like you said, that the advisory bodies will discuss amongst themselves, but just wondering if council staff have talked about if there's like a limit on the number of actions that can be considered, or how the prioritization might play out.
Oh, wow. Thanks, Whitney. That's a great question. I would say that there has not yet, to my knowledge, at least, been too much discussion of prioritization within, I think there's been more discussion within prioritization on the EFP portion of things, probably a little bit less so on if-thens and if-then statements and season management actions, et cetera, and the local knowledge pieces, the LK pieces. I would say that there is a time horizon here that is longer than, like, that we could, the council could certainly phase things. Like there could be sort of like let's try to get certain things, kind of like moving this calendar year. And then there could be things that spill over into 2027 and possibly even beyond. Although at one point we will no longer have, this particular funding will be spent down we assume by the end of 2027. And so there will be sort of resource issues after that. But, and there may be, of course, obviously workload considerations throughout for both, for staff and advisory bodies in the council. So I think that there are definitely ways of sort of pulling out things that might be a little bit more timely or urgent, or that might have more bang for the buck, things that are a little more, I don't know quite what the right word would be, but just maybe, strategically important now that could definitely rise to the top and could be, part of a phase one, if you will. And I think Katie might have some thoughts on the EFP stuff. So maybe I'll stop there and see if Katie wanted to chime in as well.
Yeah, thanks so much, Gilly. I think you're spot on. And Whitney, thank you so much for that question. I think it's so critical, and we tried to be really mindful of that aspect. And certainly on the EFP part, we don't anticipate, moving forward with the full suite of actions. I think it'll be really helpful to hear from the advisory bodies and the council, which kind of subset makes the most sense. And, we try to have that lens of where can we get the biggest bang for our buck with the least amount of effort, right, and tried to tier those, not to totally dissuade, those actions that might require a little bit more work that could be phased out, as Gilly mentioned. But I think that is a good lens to take into the advisory body discussions of which actions are going to be the most impactful that are not going to, require a ton of work from council staff or NIMP staff or, long council deliberations. So I think it's a great thing to highlight and a great thing to put that lens on as these discussions happen.
Thank you both.
Thank you. All right. Brian, I think I see your hand.
Thanks, Gilly. I appreciate that. Katie, just following up with your answer, is there any guidance on expectations by council staff in terms of how the advisory bodies can respond to these? It seemed like there were a lot of actions, upwards of 20. Are you looking for feedback on individual actions, all of them, or as you just described, maybe highlighting a key that the advisory bodies feel are most important and just focus on those? Overall, just trying to ask for a little bit of scope definition so we can focus our energies where it's most desired.
I'll let Gilly take that one since she's, got all of the pieces of the puzzle in mind there.
Oh, sure. Thank you. And thank you, Brian, for asking about that. Yeah, that's another great question. I would say that there would be, it's certainly, of course, whatever a given advisory body feels would be the best process. But I would say from my perspective, or maybe I can say our perspective as council staff, so I don't know if this is exactly how the council would feel too, but I think that it would be most useful for advisory bodies to focus in on the pieces that they are sort of most interested in, or that they feel would have the most value for their work, as opposed to having to make sort of like a comment on each and every item. I think there may be some advisory bodies that are more cross-cutting that might want to take a sort of a closer look at each and every one, but there also are I think there's a ton of value in selecting the pieces that feel most relevant, or that feel if you feel like moving forward with potential action item X, Y, or Z, it could help the teams work analytically or otherwise in these ways. So I think being able to zero in on the pieces that are most relevant and useful to you would, I think, be great, if that's helpful.
Yeah, that is. Thank you.
Yvonne.
Hi, thank you. So I just want to, I raised my hand shortly after Brian did, and I almost had the same question / comment. I think we've heard you say that we should support those those actions that we think are worth supporting, and think up other actions if we think other actions or different actions are needed. But I just want to be clear, we should certainly also tell the council which of these actions we think they should not take up, correct?
Yes, thank you, Yvonne. Yes, I think that's equally important. If there's something that feels like, oh, this doesn't quite hit the mark, or it's not aligned with the goal of the overarching goal of the project, et cetera, that would, I think, probably be very welcome as well, just to be able to start winnowing it down. So yeah, exactly. I think both sides of that coin would be equally valuable. If there's stuff that does not feel like it's like it's not the right track to be going down, I feel like communicating that to the council would be fantastic. I hope that's helpful. Heather.
Thanks, Gilly. Sort of as a follow-up to that, it seems to me with the number of advisory bodies that would be providing feedback and then the public as well, every advisory body could focus on something different that they think is the biggest bang for the buck. And maybe something that the Groundfish Advisory Panel doesn't think should be done, the Ecosystem Panel would, or things like that. So I wonder if there isn't any value to some conversations at the council meeting between the chairs of the committees, sort of in the hallway, to see if there's any kind of, or maybe it's even the staffs from each of the APs, but like to see if there is any synergy between, the panels, that they all agree we shouldn't do this, but everyone agrees we should do this, because I think that would potentially be more helpful to the council than every panel coming up with something very different that while they believe it's perfect for them, others don't feel it is, if that makes sense. Because if the limited human resource component or funding resource component is significant and we have to only go with, 2 or 3 or phase it in, I think that'll be a more challenging discussion, I guess. So I don't know, just encouraging maybe some conversations between panels during the meeting so that we can see which, when we're on the same side or where we can support each other versus everybody coming in with something different.
Thanks so much, Heather. I think that's a fantastic idea. I know that, not to put the onus on the chairs or co-chairs for having to do that coordination, but to the extent that that's feasible. I know not everybody will be in person at the April meeting, but if there's a way to, like if there's interest in making sure that you're not, right, like if somebody else's priority is not necessarily another advisory body's priority, but not wanting to necessarily say like you shouldn't do it because another group might be saying that it's a good idea. So if there's a way to kind of streamline that for folks, that would be, I think, a wonderful approach. That makes total sense. Yeah, and I see Whitney, you have your hand up, and I saw that you just had a comment as well. But go right ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Gilly. I really like that idea, Heather, and I think that's a good point. I was thinking about that too. In the past, for things like this, we have kind of just operated in our own little advisory bubbles, and the council kind of gets overwhelmed and doesn't know what to do with that information from many different directions. And I put in the chat that the GAP and GMT have a joint session on this towards the end of the meeting. I think it's on Friday, and that'll be shortly before the material. I think the materials are due that day, so there's not a lot of time for us to make substantial changes, but at least in terms of utilizing that time for discussion about where we align and maybe have differences at that point, it might be worth, if possible, having folks from other ABs and maybe just like the advisory panels, maybe just even just the chair or vice chair of other advisory bodies to sit in on that discussion and listen or provide any feedback of how those advisory panels have discussed the topic. And just using that time that's already scheduled could maybe be a great space for that, beyond adding more time to the already busy meetings that we do have once we get there. Just an idea.
Thanks, Whitney. Yeah, that sounds like a fantastic approach. Yeah, and also definitely wanting to be mindful of the fact that this is a very busy meeting for salmon folks and groundfish folks in particular, and also CPS folks. So basically all the FMP teams that are meeting. Yeah, whatever works best in terms of making this, responding to this item and weighing in on it as easy and constructive as possible is fantastic.
Hey, Gilly, this is Carrie.
Oh, Carrie.
Hello. Yeah, I think that's a good comment about, trying to sort of at least coordinate or, be aware of what other ABs are planning to say. The HMSAS and the HMSMT are having a joint session tomorrow and are going to be discussing this. So if anyone wants to, poke an ear into that and listen in, or see a draft report, or assuming that they put something in the briefing book, which I think they probably will, that also is an opportunity to, kind of see where those groups are.
Thanks, Carrie. I think I see Amber's hand.
Thanks, Gilly. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, you sound great.
Okay, good. My question is really more of a clarifying question, scope question. In looking at the attachment 1, the Gantt charts, where you've laid out like timing of all the different actions, I was curious if the thinking behind that is like taking up some of the actions in tandem, or more just viewing these actions individually. That's how you, council staff, would see them sort of mapping out through time. I asked just thinking about how we might use that in deliberations on, what's most relevant, how to prioritize it, but also thinking about what might be timing issues if they were to move forward.
Thank you, Amber. I appreciate that question. And yeah, I was actually going to see if I could share the Gantt chart really quickly without, let's see here. I'm not sure. It's thinking. Oh yeah, there it is. I don't know if I can make it full screen though, so this is maybe not very helpful. Well, anyway, there it is. And I'm going to see if I can actually scroll down a little bit. But yes, as Amber mentioned, a lot of this stuff is concurrent, the way it's sort of laid out here. I will say that that I think the thinking is that this was just to sort of show everything that, may or may not be happening kind of all at once. And with the understanding that some of these pieces may not necessarily move forward as part of a sort of a PPA type action. So there could be rows and cells on here that are no longer occupied. But I think that it's likely that a number of the things would be, like, for example, like some of the EFP related items for process improvements could potentially move, as sort of bundled items. There are sort of, there's a few of them, I think items 5, 6, and 7 are all COP related in terms of making edits to COPs or maybe rearranging things a little bit within the COPs. And so, that's something that could happen kind of all at once. And so, probably in one action, and that's 3 different action items. Similarly, I think for some of the local knowledge ideas, some of those can be bundled a little bit. And also I will note that for the local knowledge pieces, a couple of them are sort of like versions of sort of similar ideas. And so maybe the council doesn't necessarily want to do both fishery performance reports and a reporting tool. There may be reasons to do one or the other. And so depending on, how those conversations go. So I think, again, long way of saying, I think that these are things that could move, some of these things could move forward sort of in clusters or groups. And then some of them I think would probably, have to move forward independently. I think probably the most sort of independent-ish piece of all is probably the if-then statements and, opportunities for looking to expand or develop new, identify new in-season management opportunities. Those are pieces that would have to happen at the FMP level and not under, sort of a special project, or those would not necessarily be cross FMP items, whereas some of the EFP and local knowledge stuff is sort of lends itself more to cross FMP applications. So I'd say that, the pieces in attachment 2 are things that could move even more independently of everything everything else. And, sort of in that like opportunistic way, when the opportunity arises, let's be ready to move forward with, a really cool if then statement, et cetera. Anyway, I don't know if that helps at all.
If I may have a follow-up to that. So I'm
Absolutely.
taking away that you were anticipating that there are a lot of similarities across the action items. It was something that had occurred to me too. And so where we might notice that and think of some as relevant, we could comment on clustering them. That may be helpful too.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And I think the only place we did that in the attachments was really under the EFP umbrella, and sort of clustering things out clearly into tiers 1 and 2, but then also the COP related pieces could, sort of be considered, sort of things that could move together or adjacently. But yes, absolutely. I think that would be very helpful.
Thanks.
Thank you. Stop sharing for just a moment so that I can see whether there are other hands up. I don't see any other hands at the moment, but maybe we'll give it a moment in case a question or two is marinating for anyone.
Gilly, this is Amber. Since I hadn't put my hand down, but maybe it just did go down.
Oh, but that's quite all right.
So when I met with the chair in the HMSMT, we had noted that the few isn't meeting before this, so they wouldn't be able to comment as the few, but the council would weigh in here. Do you have any thoughts or perspectives on the timing of those things? And, would this item potentially expand the work of the few under their charter, or what's your perspective on that?
Oh, great question. Thanks, Amber. And I'm glad that both Katie and Carrie are here in case they would like to jump in at any point. I would say it should not expand the fuse scope at all, I don't think. I think mostly the ideas that are being put forward here would be largely applicable to other FMPs that use EFPs, or that have, the EFP option built into them, and their corresponding COPs. A lot of of course, a lot of the COP changes for COP 20, which is the COP that applies to HMS EFPs. A lot of that work is not only underway, but probably, sort of making its way through the process of, council consideration, et cetera. And if I'm not mistaken, that June is going to be a sort of an opportunity for some of those COP 20 ideas to come forward again, but maybe that's changed. So Carrie or Katie can probably correct me on that. But yeah, this should not alter the work of the few at all, or its trajectory. It may be that the one thing that I think could affect everyone is if the council is like, oh, the idea of an umbrella COP for all EFPs might be helpful, with, of course, the individual schedules or subsections or sub-COPs. Insert your terminology here for HMS, groundfish, CPS, and ecosystem component species, or I'm sorry, unmanaged forage fish in particular. So those would be, sort of potentially nested under an umbrella COP, which would require some structural changes to the existing COPs, because they would be sort of bundled into a single COP with these sub-schedules underneath them. But that wouldn't change any of the work that has already gone into those COP 20 changes, I don't think. So it might be more of a structural thing than anything else. But I don't know if Carrie or Katie wanted to say anything else and/or correct where I may have gone astray.
Sure. Thank you, Amber and Gilly. I'll jump in. My understanding, which has been the same understanding for a little while now, at least few months, is that the council heard the FEWS recommendations for COP20 in at the March meeting, and discussed them, and also knew that they were going to have a similar but broader scale discussion at the April meeting, which is what we're talking about here. And then after they have digested both what they heard in March and the FEW report and the advisory body comments on that, and then what's going to happen in April, then the council will give some direction, and I'm sure that Kelly Ames and Merrick will have some suggestions, especially if asked by the council. But they could, as far as I know, they could take a bunch of different directions. They could say, we're going to keep all the COPs separate and individual, and just move forward like that. Or we're going to have this consolidated umbrella COP and move forward like that, or some combination thereof. And they obviously wouldn't take any final action before June. If they did the umbrella COP, that seems like an awful lot of sort of coordination, and there's a lot of loose ends to figure out. So I'd be very shocked if they came back in June. If they asked the Kelly Ames to come back in June with a final umbrella COP to be adopted under that administrative agenda item as early as June. But that's just me speculating. But anyway, that's all just to say that there's a few different directions and timelines that they could take on this. But they're certainly considering both what they heard in March and what they'll hear in April, and look at the sort of differences and the nuances of the different processes among the FMPs. And so that's a long-winded way of saying I agree with what Gilly said. We don't know yet, but we'll find out what the preference for moving forward is in April. And I think hearing from all these ABs is going to be very helpful for the council to figure out the next steps.
Thanks, Carrie.
Okay. Thanks for that, Carrie and Gilly. So hearing you say, Carrie, there's a few different timelines or directions that things could take going forward, then am I right to think about those Gantt charts really as just early guidance? That's probably the fastest these actions would move, and we'll take stock of everybody's input in April and remap from there.
Thanks, Amber. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think some of those items will probably come off the list, and the focus will narrow a little bit further. And then I think that'll help the timeline look a little more. It'll just be a little bit easier to sort of think about what that might look like, for sure. Might get a little more realistic, or a little more reflective of what might be happening in going forward. But thanks for that. Not seeing any other hands at the moment, but maybe we can take a moment, unless anybody does have a question. They just haven't had a chance to raise their hand, but we could also take this moment to switch over to our public comment period, just in case there are any members of the public here who would like to say anything or chime in or ask a question or provide feedback. Not seeing any hands go up, but it's never too late. Holler anytime. All right, well, then returning to our discussion session, maybe I'll just do a last call for comments or questions or clarifications. Right. Not seeing anything at the moment, so maybe I'll just wind us down a little bit by saying that as folks know, we are recording this webinar and it will be posted on the council's website, hopefully by tomorrow, maybe even later this afternoon, where our IT folks are amazing. And so they might be able to get it posted here in the next little bit for anybody who was not able to attend. Of course, we will be, I'll be having the opportunity to chat again with many of you in advisory body forum. So that'll be great for just sort of continuing this conversation. And also, like, I would love to, sort of ponder some of the questions that folks have, some of the great questions that folks have asked already, to see if, we can bring forward any more sort of like specific, I don't know what the right word would be, not guidance, but just, like, are there any other considerations that advisory bodies should be trying to kind of think about as they put together their reports on this. Yes, and then I guess beyond that, I'll just say thank you all so very much for your time this afternoon and for your great questions, and for listening to our presentation. And feel free to email me with any other questions that may occur to you at any point, and we'll definitely keep chatting. And with that, I will go ahead and stop the recording, if I can figure out how. Well, we'll figure out that part. Okay, well, thanks, everybody.
Pause
Thanks,
button.
Gilly.
Thank you, Gilly.
Thank you all very much.